Hi, everyone. I just wanted to spend some time responding to the discussion that you all posted on diagnosis and dyslexia a couple of weeks ago. I appreciate all of the thoughtful overview of the materials that are in there. And because there were so many materials, I think there's some important synthesis that I want to put out there, some teaching that comes from having read in this area for many years now. The reading disability is something people have been studying for decades. And it's really important for us to recognize, and I think I may have mentioned this before, that the symptoms of reading disability are appearing differently in English-speaking countries and other countries that have an opaque orthography, not that one-to-one matchup type of orthography. And so there's something about our language that just makes it harder to learn to read and spell. And those linguistic facts kind of exacerbate some of the difficulties that people have naturally with learning to read. Also, that learning to read is not a humanly natural thing. It's not evolutionary. It's not like finding food. It's not like finding our people and staying with our people. It's not like love. It's not like belonging. Some of those things that we find are absolutely natural. So difficulties that people have with reading, it's really tricky to start to identify those as an actual disability, because we have to rule out all of the social and cultural factors to assume that it's a disability. And I've almost never seen people able to rule out all of those social and cultural factors. The process that the state is trying to put in place does try to do due diligence on ruling things out as they go along. And that's why that process is so important. The key thing that I need to get out there is that in my experience, 20 years working with struggling readers, I've rarely had somebody, almost never had somebody produce that kind of a process to show that they were diagnosed with dyslexia. So we have a lot of people who have either self-identified or had just a simple pediatrician diagnose them, or one meeting with a psychologist or a psychiatrist or something like that. And you have to take a lot of time to figure out that something like that is actually a disability, and those processes are important. In the meantime, our tutoring experience this semester was there to help you to see that, people do need help with reading, and whether or not it's dyslexia, you're going to try to identify which aspects are really getting in their way and teach to those. And with the people that I have met that have had those diagnoses of dyslexia, what I've come to expect, and some of you mentioned this in your postings, I appreciate that, is that it tends to show up in time and effort. So a lot of kids can get turned around really quickly because they were just never shown the right things, or they were never engaged. They were never brought along in the affective area as well as in the global and local areas. And we have a lot of kids who end up checking out on reading because they're only taught over in the local area. They don't get the comprehension and meaning. They don't get that affective interest, identity, and attitude piece brought in with it. And so they just check out. They don't like the worksheets. They don't like what counts as reading in school. So once we turn those things around, we see really fast turnarounds for a lot of the kids who people probably think are dyslexic because they've been struggling with reading all the way through 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, but they can be turned around really quickly. So with a person who's actually disabled, I would expect those things that otherwise turn people around in a matter of a few weeks of individualized attention, like we've done this semester, that for kids who are disabled, that's just going to take a lot longer time. Instead of getting a turnaround in 10, 12, 16 weeks, you're going to be looking at this year and next year and maybe the year after that to be able to make that turnaround solid for them. So the time and the effort for me is the key thing. So think about that. A lot of kids might be suspected of having dyslexia because of that time and effort piece, that it's taking a lot more time for them to catch on. But could that time difference also be explained by the fact that they're English learners? Could there be effects of poverty in their lives that are making those things more difficult? And another disability, is it not dyslexia, but just an overall learning disability that makes the pieces of reading harder because it's learning? So think about that. The fact that 80% of people with other learning disabilities are identified as dyslexic, that's troublesome because their learning disability is going to make learning harder. So how can you take that out of the equation and say, oh, yes, if you took away their learning disability, they would still have dyslexia as a difficulty. So ferreting out those differences is tricky, and it has to be done if you're going to say dyslexia. The other thing that I have to emphasize is that in the instructional cycle, the last step of the instructional cycle is so frequently missing for kids who are identified with reading disability or suspected of reading disability, and even for kids who are just struggling with reading, that last step of the instructional cycle, which is apply it to real text. So as soon as you've done your instructional cycle and you've gone over here and you've done all of these practice materials and the practice books, those constructed readers and so on, you've got to take what they're learning and say, okay, now let's go apply it to writing. Let's go find some books or some articles and apply it to reading. And that's what I tend to see missing. And so if our skills are in word identification, and they very frequently are for kids with dyslexia, vocabulary and syntax, all of those things that come into creating a fluent reader. If we're working on those skills, we can work on them in isolation all we want, but that's not going to guarantee a transfer over to authentic text. And so every day's lesson should be followed up with, now let's go transfer that to the authentic text and have a good comprehension experience with what we've been practicing. And again, that gets us to the question of, is this reading difficulty or is this reading disability? So that question of what happens when you give this kind of aggressive individualization, do you get a quick turnaround, or does the turnaround not happen as quickly as you'd hope to see? That's all part of that diagnosis process that you were evaluating from the state. So again, it's rare to see the that full process followed. And because of all of that, what I'm seeing is that those projected numbers that people have put out there, the 15 to 20%, those are ridiculously overblown numbers. I rarely see anything like that. Those projected numbers of 15 to 20% of people suffering from dyslexia, those numbers are promoted by the people selling the cure. So the people who say they have the solution and are selling programs and training programs and so on, those are the people that are telling us 15 to 20%. And because so many of the research studies that are out there on dyslexia haven't been done with diagnosed dyslexics, they've only been done with people who have had struggles with reading for longer than a year or 2 years, we can't trust even that those research studies are telling us something about dyslexia. Also, most of the brain scan research has failed to actually clearly identify that a student who they're scanning has a dyslexia diagnosis, having gone through all of those processes. So the fact that people have brain scans and one area of their brain doesn't light up when they're doing reading tasks, that actually changes with instruction. So if a kid isn't lighting up in the right area of the brain, we can do our basic tutoring sessions like we're doing now and have a quick 8-week turnaround where it's like, oh, the kid just never had the right kind of instruction, and now suddenly their brain's going to light up in the right areas, because those areas light up when the kids have the knowledge. So it's not been proven that this is an actual brain damage issue. So the other key thing that's important for all of you to remember is that the International Dyslexia Association is not an independent, scholarly, peer-governed association. They have ultimate loyalty to Orton Gillingham programs, and that's what they're trying to promote. And you'll frequently see little messages in some of their stuff that say, to prove that Dr. Orton was right. So they really don't have an interest in the scholarly inquiry, the kinds of breaking things out and figuring them out like I've been talking about. Ultimately, I think plenty of the people involved have kids' best interests at heart and are really interested in serving people and have found great use of those tools. And I think these are great tools to have, but they're not the only thing out there. And so we should always be wary when the people who are promoting a cure are actually telling us that it's an epidemic. So they're actually promoting the epidemic so that they do that. Are they doing it because they can then sell more packages? So that's a conflict of interest that comes up every time the International Dyslexia Association comes up. And we need to keep that in mind because that's extremely popular and extremely leading in Colorado and throughout the country right now. A resource that I suggest that you look at is that there is a handbook of research on reading disability. And I think I posted at least one or more articles from that handbook. That's a place we've got to go because there is a lot of research on reading disability that helps us to start to understand the difference between just struggling with reading, having difficulty with reading, and overcoming that versus having an actual disability and needing extra attention beyond just that quick turnaround that we can do with just a semester or a year of one-on-one with students. So I appreciate all of your attention to this. Regardless of what you see in your schools right now, it's a topic that needs to come up, and it needs to come up in a thoughtful way. We need to think about disability as a social and political issue too, because as soon as we start diagnosing people or giving them these disabilities, we put them into a very specific box. And people with disabilities have started becoming much stronger advocates in the theory of disability over the past 20 years, so that we don't have outside people doing these things to them. As they begin to speak out and talk to us, we'll know a lot more about how to think about struggling with reading in a lifelong way. All right. I'm going to stop there. I appreciate, again, all of the thoughtful analysis and review that you put into this discussion. And I hope that it gives you some ways that you can talk about this with your colleagues in your school without getting caught up in the stuff that kind of comes along with it. Because there's the whole problem, I think, Bryant, you brought this up, of people avoiding the topic of dyslexia. And then you swing to the other side and you have all of this salesmanship where people are aggressively promoting dyslexia. And we've got to kind of stay in this radical middle area where we're not promotional and we're not ignoring it, but we're really looking closely at what it takes to actually achieve that type of understanding of a reader, that there's something unusual, something disabling here that's going on, and it doesn't change because of aggressive one-on-one instruction over a half a school year or a full school year. All right. Talk to you soon.